Hey guys, it's Greg with Apple Explained, and today we're going to cover the history of iOS. This topic was the second place winner of last week's voting poll, and if you didn't get to vote, make sure you're subscribed. That way the voting polls will show up right in your mobile activity feed, and you can let me know which video you'd like to see next. So as you probably already know, iOS is a mobile operating system that Apple created for use on their iPhone, iPod Touch, and iPad. Now, iOS is one of the world's most popular mobile operating systems despite only running on Apple's own hardware. Compare this to the Android mobile operating system, which is licensed by Google to various hardware manufacturers and wireless carriers. Now, the debate over which approach is better is a topic we're not getting into today, because in this video, we're going to focus on the history of iOS and its development from 2007 to 2018. So back in 2007, the first version of iOS was released, but it wasn't actually called iOS back in those days. In fact, Apple didn't give the iPhone's operating system a name until 2008, when iPhone OS 2 was introduced. Up until that point, Apple marketing material simply said that the iPhone runs a version of Mac OS X, Apple's desktop operating system. But today, the first version of iOS is referred to as iPhone OS 1, and the capabilities of this OS were groundbreaking at the time, because keep in mind, the BlackBerry was leading the smartphone market back in 2006, and its operating system was considered best in class, although in retrospect it appears to be very archaic. Now, Apple recognized the shortcomings of smartphones at the time and envisioned a device that was more capable while also easier to use. The device was the iPhone, and its success depended almost entirely on its operating system, iPhone OS 1, which redefined the capabilities of a mobile device. In fact, when the first iPhone was introduced, competitors admitted to being shocked by what Apple was able to accomplish, and it sent them back to the drawing board. So exactly what about iPhone OS 1 caused such a disruption? Well, it ran applications that had almost all the capabilities of its desktop counterpart and were super easy to use thanks to the iPhone's multi-touch interface. This hadn't been the case with other smartphones, which had plastic keyboards and buttons that became quite clumsy and complicated the user experience. In fact, many of the features included in smartphones at the time weren't even being used by customers, since many couldn't figure them out. That's why Steve Jobs included this chart during the iPhone's introduction, which illustrated their goal to make the iPhone the most capable and user-friendly smartphone in the industry. Now, it's probably more interesting to talk about what iPhone OS 1 didn't have rather than what it did have. Because basically with iPhone OS 1, you had the stock apps included on the phone and that was it. But even those applications were extremely limited compared to modern versions of iOS. For example, Messages only supported SMS texting. That meant all you could do was send and receive text messages of up to 160 characters. No photos, emojis, or voice recordings. And if your message was longer than the 160 character limit, it was automatically divided into several parts. But perhaps one of the most significant features missing from iOS 1 was the App Store, but this hardly bothered anyone at all, because back in 2007, the iPhone was the most fully featured smartphone to ever exist, so very few users were complaining about the lack of apps near the beginning of the iPhone's launch. But eventually, the desire for third-party app development began to grow as many people recognized the iPhone's potential as a platform for developers. So with the next operating system release called iPhone OS 2, Apple supplied a software development kit that allowed third-party developers to create apps for the iPhone for the first time. Well, technically it wasn't the first time, since jailbroken iPhones could run third-party apps already, but obviously that effort wasn't supported by Apple. Now, there were other small improvements that came with iPhone OS 2, like always-on push emails, a scientific calculator, and Google Street View and Maps, but the App Store was definitely its headlining feature. And at launch, the App Store offered over 500 apps. Now, that number may not seem impressive compared to the 2 million apps offered today, but you can imagine it was a big step up from the original 15 stock apps included in iPhone OS 1. And users began to download so many apps that in iPhone OS 3, the number of home screen pages was increased from 9 to 11, which accommodated about 170 apps. And I should mention that iPhone OS 3 was the first version to not be fully supported on every iPhone, since the original iPhone didn't have some of the new features offered. And some of those were the long-awaited cut, copy, paste feature, Spotlight, voice memos, and video recording on the iPhone 3GS. But I think one of the most significant additions to iPhone OS 3 was MMS support in Messages, and that meant users could finally send and receive photos, contacts, locations, voice recordings, and video messages. Now, it was during the lifespan of iPhone OS 3 that the iPad was introduced, and at the same time, Apple decided to rename iPhone OS to iOS, since it was now being used by devices other than the iPhone. And in 2010, Apple introduced iOS 4, which brought with it some really advanced capabilities like FaceTime video calling through Wi-Fi, improved multitasking features, home screen folders which held up to 12 apps each, 5 times digital camera zoom, AirPlay, AirPrint, and the ability to create personal hotspots depending on carrier support. So iOS 4 was a significant upgrade released alongside the iPhone 4, but there was one problem, and it had to do with the algorithm that calculated the iPhone's signal strength. Now, this issue may sound pretty insignificant, but it threw Apple into a PR nightmare that was dubbed AntennaGate. You see, iPhone 4 users noticed their network bars would fall dramatically when gripping their phone in a certain way, and this was thought to be a design flaw caused by the iPhone 4's new antenna system, but for the most part, it turned out to be an issue with iOS 4's signal strength algorithm, and Apple later released a software update that fixed this issue. Now, in October 2011, iOS 5 was introduced alongside the iPhone 4S, and this update delivered one of the iPhone's most iconic features, Siri. And when Siri was first released, it was far and away the best digital assistant on the market, although that hasn't necessarily been the case in recent years. Now, other major additions in iOS 5 was an overhaul to notifications, which included passive banner alerts along with Notification Center. And for the first time, software updates could be delivered to iOS 5 over the air, which meant you didn't have to connect your iPhone to a computer every time an update was available. Other features included multitasking gestures for the iPad, a camera shortcut on the lock screen, synced iMessages across devices, group messaging, and native emoji keyboard support. This was also when the iPod app was replaced by the music and video apps. Now, iOS 6 came near the end of 2012, and it was infamous for replacing the native Google Maps app with Apple's own version called Apple Maps. Now, Apple Maps did offer some cool features like turn-by-turn directions and flyover views in select locations, but it just didn't have the same level of detailed map data that Google Maps had, and it showed. When users started getting directions from Apple Maps, they found it to be very unreliable. Location data could be inaccurate, certain cities were missing entirely, and many establishments were mislabeled. The release of Apple Maps became so problematic that Apple CEO Tim Cook issued an open letter of apology saying he was extremely sorry for the frustration and that the company fell short on the commitment of bringing world-class products to its customers. And internal debate over this apology became so heated that one of Apple's long-serving executives, Scott Forstall, actually left Apple during this time. Now, apart from Apple Maps, iOS 6 introduced some other well-known features that you probably use today, including Passbook, now known as Wallet, enhancements to Siri, shared photo streams, FaceTime over cellular, and panorama mode. So iOS 6 brought some important improvements to the iPhone, but its true significance wasn't clear until Apple released iOS 7, because it was at that point everyone realized iOS 6 would be the last version to retain the iPhone's classic skeuomorphic interface. Under the leadership of Jonathan Ive, iOS 7 ushered in the era of flat design. It got rid of reflections, shadows, textures, and app interfaces that resembled real-life objects. This change was actually quite shocking at the time, and many users were turned off by iOS 7's flat, colorful design. But Apple stuck with their decision, and the iOS interface remains flat to this day. Now, iOS 7 brought more than just a new look. It featured AirDrop, CarPlay support, new Siri voices, parallax wallpapers, FaceTime audio, and iTunes Radio. So iOS 7 was a big leap forward for the iPhone, but it needed some refinements and optimizations, and Apple delivered exactly that in September 2014 with iOS 8. It allowed the iPhone to integrate even more seamlessly with the Mac through features called handoff and continuity, which allowed tasks like writing an email to be started on one device and seamlessly picked up on another. This also meant you could answer phone calls and send MMS messages from your Mac. Now, one of the biggest performance optimizations included in iOS 8 was Metal, which allowed developers to use the iPhone's graphics processor in a more efficient way, improving the performance of their games and apps. Other features like HomeKit, Apple Pay, and Hey Siri were also announced with iOS 8. Now, 2014 was a big year for machine learning, and Apple took advantage of this technology in iOS 9, introduced in late 2015. The main focus for this release was intelligence, since iOS 9 featured something called Proactive, which combined Siri and Search to provide you with contextual information that it thinks you might need before you ask for it. This feature was also integrated into apps like Mail, where a calendar event could be automatically created if a date is found within the email. iOS 9 also introduced Low Power Mode, a highly requested feature, which provided the iPhone with an extra hour of battery life after reaching 20%. Other important features included an upper and lowercase keyboard and support for wireless CarPlay. Now, by this point, there was one feature that many users wanted desperately, and that was to hide native apps, because most users probably didn't use something like the Stocks app and they preferred to remove it from their home screen entirely. And that feature is exactly what they got with iOS 10 in 2016. But there were actually quite a few highly anticipated additions to iOS 10, including Raise to Wake, unlocking with the Home button, a multi-page control center, and a universal clipboard that allowed elements to be copied on one device and pasted to another. But despite the new control center design in iOS 10, Apple decided to change it again in iOS 11 just 1 year later. This time it brought all the controls to one full screen page that users could customize to their liking. But the big focus of iOS 11 was augmented reality. Apple developed something called ARKit, which allowed developers to integrate advanced AR technology into their apps for the first time. And when it came to the iPad, iOS 11 delivered some incredible productivity features, including drag and drop, a new multitasking interface, and support for 4 active apps on screen at the same time. Now, the most recent version, iOS 12, is available for download September 17, 2018, and not only is it supposed to increase device performance by 70%, but iOS 12 also has some really helpful productivity features like screen time, which gives you detailed reports of how much time you spend on your device and what you're doing. There's also something called Siri Shortcuts, which allows users to program a series of actions that should happen automatically at a certain time. For example, to start their day, users can set their lights to turn on, coffee maker to begin brewing, and iPhone to display the News app. But of course, this is assuming your appliances and lights are connected through HomeKit. Now, there are a lot of other cool features like ARKit 2, Measure, and Do Not Disturb during bedtime, but something I'm really excited about is how well iOS 12 appears to be running on older devices. Several beta testers have reported their older iPhones becoming noticeably faster after updating, and if this is true for all older iPhones, I think it'll be one of iOS 12's most important features. So that is the history of iOS, and if you want to vote for the next video topic, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.